Greetings, everyone. I'm Dr. Ronald Angelo Johnson, the Ralph and Bessie May Lynn Chair of History in the Department of History at Baylor University. And I want to welcome each of you to the 2021 Black History Month Book Talk. In the 1920s, the African-American historian, Dr. Carter G. Woodson, proposed the second week of February as Negro History Week to recognize the importance of Black history to the ongoing complex story of the United States. Nearly a century later, Black History Month offers us, the Baylor family and today's virtual community, a grand opportunity to explore the central role of Black life in America. In recognition of the contributions of Black people to advancing the ideals of freedom and opportunity across early America, the Baylor History Department is proud to sponsor with the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic, SHEAR, and bring you today's talk by Dr. Kellie Carter Jackson on her fabulous book, Force and Freedom, Black Abolitionists and the Politics of Violence. At this time, I'd like to invite the president of SHEAR, Dr. Amy Greenberg, the George Winfrey Professor of American History at Penn State University, to say a few words. Amy?
Greetings, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. As Professor Johnson said, I'm the president of the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic. For over 40 years, our society, which we call SHEAR, has served as the premier organization advancing the historical knowledge of the decades between the Revolution and the Civil War. Now, at the time of the Revolution, slavery was an acknowledged fact in each of the 13 original colonies. And as it slowly died out north of the Mason-Dixon line, very slowly, it became the defining feature of the Southern states and ultimately the defining fact of antebellum political history. It became the reason why the North and the South got into the Civil War. The story of Black men and women, both enslaved and free, is at the heart of the history of the early American Republic. And it's Black scholars, including our featured speaker today and your own Professor Johnson, who are bringing this really important and central history to light. So as SHEAR's president, I just want to say how pleased I and SHEAR am to be co-sponsors of this year's Black History Month seminar featuring Professor Kellie Carter Jackson. Professor Jackson's book, Force and Freedom, Black Abolitionists and the Politics of Violence, was the 2020 winner of SHEAR's James H. Broussard Best First Book Prize. And I will quote from the prize committee's effusive praise of this volume to give you a sense of the treat that you're in for this evening. Carter Jackson takes the discussion of Black resistance into new and largely unwritten territory, underscoring the necessity of the enslaved and free Black people to use violence in their engagement with the abolitionist movement. By focusing on Black abolitionists and the philosophy of political violence, Carter Jackson adds another compelling piece to the history of abolition in America. Her argument that the politics of violence helped prepare the nation to view Black people as equal Americans with unalienable rights is elegant and persuasive. She adeptly situates her narrative in the context of milepost events from the American Revolution and Haiti to the Civil War. By centering violence as both rhetoric and political strategy within the abolitionist movement, Carter Jackson integrates anti-slavery ventures as part of a centuries-long, ongoing fight for freedom and equality. Lucidly written and powerfully argued, Force and Freedom is a real page-turner. Carter Jackson's riveting book will have a profound impact on the history of slavery and abolition and on the history of the early American Republic generally. So thank you, Professor Carter Jackson.
Thank you so much, Dr. Greenberg. Robert Lockhart is senior editor for American History at the University of Pennsylvania Press, which published Force and Freedom in 2019. Robert?
Thank you, Ron. I had the pleasure of serving as Professor Carter Jackson's editor on her book, which means we worked on it page by page before it got printed, went to the printer. So I was there early on, and I was just a sheer pleasure to work with Professor Carter Jackson on her book. She and I actually met for the first time in Philadelphia, where the University of Pennsylvania Press is located. And Philadelphia has a pretty strong history in this period of time. It's home to Independence Hall, the Liberty Bell. It's where the Declaration of Independence was written and where the Constitution was signed. Philadelphia also has a strong African-American history tradition. Mother Bethel Church is the oldest African Methodist Episcopalian church in the country, and it still exists to this day. So the University of Pennsylvania Press has an interest in publishing in both fields. And Professor Carter Jackson's book beautifully combines them together into a prize-winning book. It's actually one of only a few books that I have published in my 20-year career that has won SHEAR's Best First Book Prize. So I consider Professor Carter Jackson to be one of my most successful authors and one of my favorite as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. For everyone following the talk, Dr. Carter Jackson will respond to questions from the audience. So I'd like to invite you during the talk and even after to please type your questions in the Q&A section, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. And any of us who've done book talks before, sometimes the Q&A section is the funnest part because it allows the audience to have their engagement. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kellie Carter Jackson, the NAFL Assistant Professor of the Humanities in the Department of Africana Studies at Wellesley College. She earned her BA at her beloved Howard University and a PhD from Columbia University. In addition to the Broussard Prize, Force and Freedom was also a finalist for the prestigious Frederick Douglass Prize. And so later on this evening, and we're so thrilled that you took out the time to be with us this afternoon. This evening, Dr. Carter Jackson will be recognized at the Douglass Prize ceremony sponsored by Yale University's Gilder Lehrman Center. Congratulations. And with that, Dr. Carter Jackson, please tell us more about this wonderful book, Force and Freedom.
Thank you so much. Thank you for those kind words, that introduction. I'm on a high right now. Today, all of this week, all of this month for Black History Month has just been incredible. And I'm always excited to share my work. I can't thank Bob enough. I tell everyone that, you know, Bob's careful hands really helped shape this book, and he always encouraged me, and he never took the force out of my writing. I think sometimes editors want to sanitize the things that you write, and I love that he allowed me to really be forceful and to really have a voice within this book and to share my ideas and my thoughts and my arguments in this way. I'm just so grateful to be able to be here here in Massachusetts, but with you all, a larger part of the Baylor community. First, I just want to say my thoughts and prayers have been with the state of Texas. My family, a good portion of my family lives in Houston, in the Houston area, and they were without power and without water, and pipes burst. And so I'm glad that now all of them have power and water, but I know that it was touch and go and still is for some people. And so our thoughts and prayers are with Texas at this time. So I don't want to take too long. I want to be able to give you an overview of the book, give you some of my thoughts and comments for maybe about 25, 30 minutes, and then we can have the rest of the time for Q&A. So what I'm going to do right now is just share my screen with you so that I can show you some of these images. And can I get a thumbs up if you can see me and see the screen? Okay, yeah, great. Okay, so first and foremost, I just want to say that when I started writing Force and Freedom, when I started thinking about this as a grad student at Columbia, even goes back a little bit earlier to my time at Howard University. I had the real privilege and honor of working in some of the greatest archives, of reading some of the greatest, Black newspapers and speakers and orators and abolitionists of the time. And I'll never stop being in awe of the courage that Black abolitionists and Black leaders had at this moment. But one time, a few years ago, I won't say what school I was at, I was teaching a class and a student came up to me in the middle of class, raised his hand and said, "Who is Harriet Tubman?" And I was like, "What?" And I tried to sort of restrain my face. And I was like, okay. And I was about to go into this whole, spiel about who Harriet Tubman was. And then he goes, "Oh, I remember. She's the woman who wouldn't get off the bus." And I was like, oh, no. And the whole class, kind of had a good laugh and corrected him very quickly. But I realized that, his inability to recognize who Harriet Tubman was, or to confuse her with Harriet Tubman, kind of falls right in line with what the Nigerian author Chimamanda Adichie talks about when she gives this great TED talk called The Danger of the Single Story. And she says, oftentimes we're given like one story, one history, one person over and over again, and that's really what that moment or that movement becomes. And I think that when we talk about Black history, oftentimes we're only presented it through this very narrow single story lens, which is you get one great Black man and one great Black woman really per century, and that's kind of it. And that is what's, the sad telling and retelling of Black history, is that it's been dwindled down to just a couple people. So I like to joke that in the 18th century, the one great Black man, one great Black woman is like Crispus Attucks. If you live in or around the Boston area like I do, Crispus Attucks is the first casualty of the American Revolution. And that really is his only sort of claim to fame. Or Phyllis Wheatley, the first Black woman to ever be published in North America. But again, they represent that great Black man and the great Black woman. I think in the 19th century, it's Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. And for a lot of my students, they represent like the only Black abolitionists, the only Black leaders that they can recognize. Maybe Sojourner Truth, maybe a couple other people, but for the most part, one great Black man, one great Black woman. And in the 20th century, it's the same. It's MLK and Rosa Parks. King and his speech becomes the one great speech. Rosa Parks and her act of defiance becomes that one major act. And that is sort of how we sum up the 20th century. And even in the 20th century, I joke that it's like Obama and Oprah, right? Like you've got that one great Black man and one great Black woman. I would add that maybe you could throw in Michelle Obama, or you could throw in Kamala Harris now. But for the most part, this is what a lot of Black history boils down to. So when I started writing about the abolitionists, I really wanted to show this is a big movement. This movement involves hundreds of people, that there's actually no prototype for what an abolitionist looks like. You could be a man or a woman, and white or Black, or born free, or a fugitive. There really wasn't sort of a stereotypical person that you could be. Everyone and anyone could be involved within the abolitionist movement. It was really important for my students to see that there's a large diversity and range in how we understand abolitionist leadership. But I also wanted to talk about why I focus on Black abolitionists. And I think that's also really important. And I want to list a few reasons as to why. The first reason is that I, like many of my colleagues, love Benjamin Quarles. And when I read his book, Black Abolitionists, he makes a very powerful argument that Black abolitionists are the first abolitionists, that no one needed to tell them, you know what, slavery is wrong. They knew that. They knew that already. And were the first people to really start to advocate for the end of the institution of slavery long before other white leadership came along. I also think that when we talk about Black abolitionists, we're really talking about how we think about broader traditions of Black resistance. And I say this because oftentimes students will say to me, oh, your work, it reminds me of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, or violence versus nonviolence. And I'm like, yes, exactly. But 100 years earlier, oftentimes we get stuck in the civil rights movement and the long freedom struggle. And a lot of these struggles took place so much earlier. And so I want to shift the timeline a little bit and center it on Black abolitionists. The third reason I talk about Black abolitionists is because I think they counter this perspective of white paternalism. This is something that Manisha Sinha writes about in her work, where she says, in talking about Black abolitionists, we're trying to debunk the myth that this was a white man's struggle to end slavery, and that only white men were a part of this movement. And then finally, I think it's important to understand that Black men and women in the abolitionist movement were the most susceptible to the brunt of pro-slavery violence. That when Black communities were destroyed and attacked, when their churches were burned down or their schools were burned down, they were the ones on the front line facing the assaults of that anti-abolitionist violence. And lastly, I will say, and I think this deserves its own slide, is that Black abolitionists are really pushing for a twofold mission. And that is the end of slavery through emancipation, but also they're pushing for equality. They really see emancipation as a first step. It is not the final step. And that emancipation doesn't mean anything unless you have equality. And so when I was a student at Howard University, I remember a professor of mine said, white abolitionists approach the movement like a free the whales campaign. You know, free the whales, don't hurt the whales. But whales can't vote, and whales can't marry my daughter, and whales really aren't people, and whales don't have our intellectual capacity. Like, there were all of these caveats put in place when it came to Black humanity, when it came to Black enfranchisement. And so Black abolitionists are really pushing these ideas. It's really one of the only two ideas that they have so much solidarity on. And I also think it's important to quote Joshua Easton. He's another Black abolitionist, and he says this in 1837, words that I feel like are so profound, but in some ways so prophetic. He says, abolitionists may attack slaveholding, but there's a danger still that the spirit of slavery will survive in the form of prejudice after the system is overturned. Our warfare ought not to be against slavery alone, but against the spirit which makes color of mark of degradation. The spirit which makes color a mark of degradation. And I think this is so important because even though we have dismantled the institution of slavery and we have the 13th Amendment, the spirit of slavery is still very much with us. We saw the spirit of slavery on January 6th at the storming of the Capitol. We see the spirit of slavery in housing segregation. We see the spirit of slavery with COVID-19 and the global pandemic. And what Joshua Easton is really saying is that, again, ending slavery is a first step, but how we deal with anti-Blackness, how we deal with prejudiceness, that's the whole ball game. So these are some questions I just want you to think about, and we can talk about this in the Q&A. The first is this idea of, when is violence ever justified? And if it is justified, what makes it effective? I think oftentimes when we think about the courses that we take, especially in college, they are all benchmarked by violence. They're all timelined by violence. So maybe you took a course from the slave trade to the Civil War, or the Civil War to the present, or the war between the wars, or Vietnam, or World War I, or World War II. We're constantly using violence to benchmark our understandings of major turning points in history. So my question is, when is it justified? When is it effective? When does it produce change? The second question is, how should the oppressed respond to their oppression? What is appropriate? If you are not considered a citizen, and the Dred Scott decision said you were not, if you were not considered to have any rights which white men were bound to respect, if you could not vote, you did not have the ballot, then how could you, as an oppressed person, respond to your oppression, advocate for yourself politically, economically, or socially in ways that produce change? And then thirdly, what's the responsibility of the state? Like, what's the nation's response, or what should the nation's response be to political dissent? How should the nation respond to oppressed peoples, or marginalized peoples, or people without power? Essentially, all of these questions are sort of asking the same thing, which is, how do the powerless procure power? How do the powerless procure power? So I want to give a quick little historical context about moral suasion for those who don't know what it is or aren't familiar with it. Just know that moral suasion was an ideology, a campaign to morally persuade people that slavery was wrong and that nonviolence was a tactic to abolish the institution of slavery. And I say this because all throughout the 1830s, America is not just experiencing the rise of a formal abolitionist movement, but also a great awakening, a religious awakening in which people believe that Christ is coming back, and don't let him come and find you a slaveholder when he returns, right? So people are trying to get people to understand that slavery is a sin, not just a crime, but it's a sin. And so all during the 1830s, when they are pushing for the immediate abolition of the enslaved, the response is anti-abolitionist riots, anti-abolitionist mob attacks. If you look on this map, these are all pinpoints of cities in which the abolitionists were attacked, slaughtered, murdered. If you look in Philadelphia, in the city of brotherly love, Bob and I's favorite town, You see that in 1820, 29, 34, 35, 38, 42, 49. There are anti-abolitionist mob attacks. And you see Black churches destroyed. You see Black schools destroyed. In places where there are like 2 Black people, like Maine, there is still an anti-abolitionist mob attack. And all during this moment, all during this decade, people like William Lloyd Garrison are saying, do not return violence for violence, turn the other cheek. But then the 1850s comes along, and I think the 1850s shifts a lot of people's thinking. For one, the abolitionists have been at this game for like 20 years, and they've seen no new legislation that has been in their favor. Matter of fact, every piece of legislation that has come out in the antebellum period has really favored slave owners and slave ownership. And we also see that the country is shifting and expanding and growing geographically, and that America is at a crossroads. So I'm taking you back to like 8th grade history when we talk about the Compromise of 1850, and I won't go into it that much, but I want you to know that at this pivotal moment in which the political stronghold of America is being decided, which state will enter as a slave state, which state will enter as a free state, a compromise was created by Henry Clay and others to keep the country at war and to keep the country from falling apart over slave divisive lines. They do a number of things in this compromise, but one of the greatest things that they do is issue or revamp the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. So the Fugitive Slave Law is actually an old law. It had been on the books since like 1793. George Washington himself invokes the Fugitive Slave Law when he's trying to get enslaved property that had run away from him during the Revolution. We can talk about that hypocrisy later too, fighting for revolution and freedom while also sending out slave catchers for your property. But this law was something that was old, but something that didn't have a whole lot of teeth on it. It was really hard to enforce. So when they revamped it in the 1850s, they said, we're going to put some parameters around this. One, doesn't matter if you ran away 5 days ago, 5 years ago, 5 months ago, you could be living longer in freedom than you were in slavery. And you were susceptible, you were vulnerable from being taken up by U.S. Marshals or federal officials and being sent back to your planter. If you were a white American living in the North and I, as a U.S. Marshal, saw someone, Tom, let's say, Tom, that looks like Tom, I could deputize you on the spot and say, hey, help me get Tom. And you had no choice. You had to comply, or you could face a 6-month prison sentence. You could face a $1,000 fine. So there were real consequences to not abiding or not enforcing the retrieval of enslaved property. When this law happens, a lot of Black abolitionists, this is the breaking point for them. I talk about in the book how, moral suasion was this house that William Lloyd Garrison built, but that Black people were merely renters, that they didn't own these ideas or these principles. And Martin Delany says, in contempt for the Fugitive Slave Law, if an officer searching for fugitives crosses the threshold of my door and I do not lay him a lifeless corpse at my feet, I hope the grave may refuse my body a resting place and the righteous heaven my spirit a home. So basically, Delaney's like, I wish somebody would come in my door. I wish somebody would try to get some fugitive slaves from me. Like, Black people get radicalized by this moment. It's a major turning point for them. And they believe that because slavery was created by violence, because slavery was sustained by violence, that it only made sense that violence would be the solution to overthrowing the institution. And so many of them start their own Black self-protection societies. This is an example of one founded by William Parker, his wife, Eliza Parker, in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, a border town. And then William Parker says something really profound here. He says, the laws of personal protection are not made for us, and we're not bound to obey them. If a fight occurs, I want the whites to keep away. They have a country. They may obey the laws, but we have no country. And I think this is so interesting too, because he says this about 5 or 6 years before the Dred Scott case that basically says Black people have no rights. Black people are not citizens. And what he's saying is, I don't want to fight. I'm not going to be on the offensive. But if someone comes for me, I have no obligation to not use force or to not use violence to protect myself. or maybe, sorry, I do have an obligation to use force and violence to protect myself. And he does just that. One of the incidents I talk about in the book is the Christiana Resistance, in which William and Eliza Parker had developed a reputation living on the border in Pennsylvania, a free state, next to Maryland, a slave state. Maryland had a high number of runaways because of the proximity of a region in which they could get to free territories and get even further north up to Canada. And so in this particular incident, the Lancaster Protection Society is always on alert. And because they have this reputation, 4 runaway slaves run to the Parkers' home seeking refuge. They hide them in their attic. And it's only a matter of hours before, the master, the marshal, the master's son, the master's nephew show up to Parker's house saying, "We know your reputation. We know you have our slaves. I want my property back." And it's remarkable because William Parker's like, "Over my dead body. I'm not giving you the enslaved." And we made a vow that even at the risk of our own lives, would we refuse to return fugitive slaves. So what happens is kind of wild. Shots are fired. Eliza Parker sounds this alarm and alerts the Black Lancaster Self-Protection Society. Dozens of men and women show up armed with pistols, rifles, but also with farm equipment, with pitchforks, whatever they can use to defend these fugitive slaves. And I think it's also interesting that Eliza Parker picks up a corn cutter, a tool she undoubtedly knew how to use, and threatened that she would chop off the head of the first member of their band who tried to give them up. That member was her brother. So her brother is inside their home panicking, saying just give them up, just surrender, just let them go. And she picks up that corn cutter and says, "No way, we will not forfeit anyone." As shots are fired and commotion and chaos ensue, Edward Gorsuch, the slave owner, lays lying on the ground near death. And William Parker says something profound when he writes about this in The Atlantic. He says, "The women put it into him. The women put it into him. They saw Edward Gorsuch laying on the ground dying, and the women put it into him." And I think that is so remarkable because it shows us that violence is not gendered in this moment, that both men and women, Black men and women, are using force and using violence to defend themselves, to protect themselves, and using it to combat the institution of slavery. So I want to tell another story. This will be real quick about Lewis Hayden. He's one of my favorite abolitionists. Not a lot of people know about him. Everybody loves Douglass. I love Douglass too, but Lewis Hayden is like a boss in my mind. He is the president of the Underground Road and the Black Self-Protection Society in Boston. He believes in violence. He believes in force or protective violence, as I talk about it in the book. He keeps armed guards around him wherever he goes. And reportedly, he kept 2 kegs of gunpowder in his home so that whenever slave catchers came to his door, he would open up the door and he would have his candlestick and he would see, "You see those 2 kegs of gunpowder right there? You can leave in peace or you can leave in pieces." That was his response to how he would deal with slave catchers. And no one wanted to call his bluff, right? No one wanted to mess with someone like Hayden. When you think about, the Anthony Burns rescue, there is a U.S. Marshal that is killed in that rescue. It's Lewis Hayden that shoots him. And I could go on and on about Lewis Hayden, but I want to start to wrap up. I want to start to tell just a quick story from the book that I think, just a short couple paragraphs that I think is really powerful, and then we can open it up for Q&A. I'm checking my time to make sure. Okay, we're good on time. So this is a slave ad that just says, "Fugitive slaves, attention. The slaveholders among us, be on your guard and arrest this plan. Be ready to receive them whenever they come." They let both men and women know, "Hey, women, you're working in and out of these, houses or boarding houses or places where people receive service. If you hear someone with a Southern accent, let us know. If you see someone that looks unfamiliar, let us know." People were constantly on guard. That's why they were called these vigilant societies. You had to be vigilant at all times to look out for someone who might be trying to return you or capture you. So this I'm going to talk about is just a quick excerpt of the book. It's about the escape of John Anderson. I don't have a picture of John Anderson, but I wanted to find someone who was speaking. So these two pictures, one is of William Lloyd Garrison giving a speech. Another is of Frederick Douglass during the storming of the mob at Tremont Temple. But that's just for visual effects. I'll tell you, the story of John Anderson is quite remarkable. And this is on page... where is it? 77 in my book. It says, times were changing. When John Anderson, escaped slave who fled to Canada, gave his testimony before an audience, he received a great and prolonging cheering. As Anderson approached the crowd, he modestly declared that he was not used to public speaking, and he only wanted to say a few words about his experiences and escape from slavery. He reported that in order to escape bondage, he had to cut and run and fight and shed blood. Quote, I don't like to shed blood, he added. That's what's called fighting in war. I believe, and the audience erupted with cries of, you did right, and hear, hear. Anderson, heavy with regret, told the audience that he had tried everything in his ability to evade his pursuer, to avoid killing him. He had warned his pursuer that if he continued to follow him, he would slay him. Pursued for 2 or 3 hours longer, Anderson recounted that the man would not leave him, and so he killed him. Again, the audience erupted with affirmation, shouting, bravo, and you did right. He concluded that while he regretted his actions, it was the only alternative to prevent from being taken back into bondage. He claimed he was a Christian man and hoped that after the murder, he could still be considered a godly man. The crowd erupted again by cheering and shouting, it is a justifiable act. The Reverend Chairman of the meeting proclaimed that if there was any kind of defense that was right, then one should fully endorse the opinion so loudly expressed in the meeting. Then the chairman added, quote, John Anderson did perfectly right. Does our fugitive friend look like a murderer? The response of the audience was resounding. Hear, hear, and no, no. The days of non-resistance were over. Now a fugitive slave could kill his pursuer and produce excitement and applause among public audiences. He could even still be considered a Christian. The resistance that resulted from the Fugitive Slave Law was an indication to the degree to which Black abolitionists were willing to rely on force. At the Black Ohio State Convention, the leadership argued that white Americans could perform peaceful reform with the ballot, but Black Americans could employ reform only through violence. For too long, the Black community had turned the other cheek and engaged in the tactic of moral suasion and non-resistance and accomplished little. The Fugitive Slave Law presented them with the impetus and the opportunity to take matters into their own hands. Individual and collective protective defense by African Americans proved their strength and their ability to manufacture change. Black leaders would be the most discussed political figures who ran not for office, but for freedom. Violence would be the new political tool for the oppressed, the new method of casting a ballot for progress. So I want to just show a couple more quotes that I think are really important and then close with that. This is Frederick Douglass's, a lot of people know Malcolm X's The Ballot or the Bullet speech, but once again, 100 years earlier, about a month before Lincoln's election, Frederick Douglass declares, if speech alone could have abolished slavery, the work would have been done long ago. What we want is anti-slavery government in harmony with our anti-slavery speech, one which will give effects to our words and translate them into acts. For this, the ballot is needed. And if this will not be heard or heeded, then the bullet. We have had enough and we are sick of it. Abby Kellie, who's a Quaker, a white woman Quaker, says something really profound. She says, since slavery was maintained by force, it must be justly opposed in the same way. She had the question is not whether we shall counsel the slaves to forsake peace and commence war. The war exists already and has been waged unremittingly ever since the slave has been in bondage. She's basically saying slavery is warfare. And a friend of hers, Lucy Stanton, says the same thing. She says, slavery is the combination of all crime. It is war. It is war. She gives this speech actually at the Oberlin commencement address in which she talks about the institution of slavery being that simple, the combination of all crime, war. And then lastly, the philosophy of force. This is James McCune Smith, who says, our white brethren cannot understand us unless we speak to them in their own language. They recognize only the philosophy of force. So as I close, I have one more quote. This is by Douglas. That I was wrapping up. Okay, yes, I am wrapping up. This is by Douglas. And he also says something that I think is profound and that I think bears discussion. He says, he's talking about the American Civil War, and he says, through the force of events, the American public discovered and accepted more truth in 4 years of Civil War than they learned in 40 years of peace. More truth in 4 years of war than in 40 years of peace. And I think that should tell us something about what we believe force could accomplish that moral suasion could not. I think the answer to that is freedom. I think the answer to that is, when we look at the Civil War and we look at the introduction of Black troops and the 250,000 men that helped turn the tide of the war, we see what force and violence could accomplish. So as I close, I just want to say that oftentimes, we think about how do we connect this to today? How do we make sense of the idea or the utility of force and the utility of violence? And one of the ways I've addressed that is thinking about how over a spectrum of history, we've looked at Black resistance and Black protest, from the Abolitionist Movement to the washerwoman strike, to the sanitation worker strike, to voting rights, to Ferguson, to Colin Kaepernick, to Black Lives Matter. And I can't always tell you what the correct form of protest is. But what I can tell you is this. There is no form of protest that white supremacy is going to sanction. There is no form of protest that white supremacy is going to approve of. So whether you take a knee or you throw a Molotov cocktail, the response is almost always the same: more violence. So I think we can end with that. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Thank you so much for your time. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Wow.
There we go.
Wow, Dr. Carter Jackson. One of the things that Zoom cannot replicate is the applause and the amens you will be getting from a live audience. So I've just done both. My little one-handed thing, it represents all of the audience. Thank you so very much for that wonderful, wonderful presentation. And now as we begin our Q&A session, I do want to say that already in the Q&A section, there are you guys are populating that with questions. I appreciate that. Please let those continue. As a courtesy to our partners today, I'm going to ask the SHEAR president, Dr. Greenberg, if she would pose our first question.
Oh, thank you. I always like getting a question in there. So Professor Carter Jackson, I'm so glad that you ended with the Frederick Douglass quote about ballots versus bullets. Now, we have all encountered that quote, and when you hear it, at least for me, I always thought, well, he's saying the nation needs to go to war about this. But the thing that's so crazy about your book is that you uncover the war that's already going on. The fact that there are Black people who are physically defending themselves with guns. Yeah. And that seems to totally be missing from our story of Black protest before the Civil War. It's as if when the Massachusetts Black Regiment gets guns, that's the first time Black people have guns, right? And it's like fantastic. And we talk about like, wow, they were able to do this thing that Frederick Douglass talks about in his autobiography, which is that prove yourself a man by fighting back. And in Frederick Douglass's autobiography, it's when he fights the slave driver Covey, right? He fights him. He doesn't use a gun, right? He just physically bests him. Yeah. So guess what my question is like, why don't we know about this? Like, why is the Lewis Hayden story? Why did I have to read your book to learn about Lewis Hayden?
Why did I have to write my book to learn about Lewis Hayden? Is the question. I mean, Lewis Hayden deserves a movie. He is incredible. And he's not alone. There are other people in the book as well that I feel like deserve their own biographies. And And I will say that there are other scholars, doing the work. I'm so excited for Carol Anderson's book. She has a book coming out this spring about the Second Amendment and race, and it's all about Black people and their relationship with the gun. Nicholas Johnson has also written a phenomenal book about the Negro and the gun. There's a long, rich history of the Second Amendment, gun ownership, and Black people. And I think it's something that we have to discuss more, because in a lot of ways you cannot separate the Second Amendment or the NRA and race. They go almost hand in hand. But what people don't realize is that, these early laws that were created to keep Black people from owning guns and gun ownership were never really enforced. Black people always found ways to protect themselves. And even when we think of the iconic picture of Harriet Tubman sort of leaning up against a long barrel rifle, or when we think about Ida B. Wells, and she talks about, every home should have a rifle in their corner. When we think about Fannie Lou Hamer, who talks about, I keep a gun in every corner of my house. And it's even crazy that in my own family, I did not grow up with guns. I did not grow up hunting or anything like that. But when I was in college, my grandmother died, and we were like going through her, her things and trying to get her apartment ready. And I opened up the side drawer of her bed, her nightstand, and there was a pistol. And I was like, Grandma, I was shocked. But, I realized my grandmother's from the South. She's from Louisiana. This makes sense. Like, we may not talk about it or parade it in the way that, we've seen, the NRA do or other groups do. But Black people have a long, rich relationship with the gun. And that's why I wanted to put it on the cover of the book. Bob and I had a conversation about this, but I was like, I want a gun on the cover. He's like, oh, Kellie, I don't know. But, but I think it's what's more forceful, what's more arresting, right, than a gun. I think it encapsulates this entire moment, this entire movement, really. And I think there's more that needs to be written about guns and Black people, for sure. And not just in a historic context, but even in a contemporary context.
No, and actually that the ending of that question really helps transition into another question. The question actually comes from a Baylor University undergraduate student, Asia Brown, and she writes, in your book, you provide readers a deeper historical context to explain why and how Black people sought liberation through violence. And then both Ms. Brown and then my colleague from the history department, George Galwich, asked this question in the Q&A. In what ways do you see a historical foundation for the politics of violence as an act of liberation in today's society? And how does violence relate to the way we engage slavery today?
I think that I get this question a lot. Can the work that was done by Black abolitionists 200, 150 years ago be accomplished today? And I think the answer is no, or not in that same way. And that is because, for a number of reasons, I think that when we look at the abolitionist movement, or when we look at the institution of slavery, we all can look back, hopefully all of us can look back and say, slavery was wrong, slavery was a sin, slavery was evil, it was a crime. And of course, you would use violence to overthrow it. I think that even we can look at the long freedom struggle and the civil rights movement and say, I can understand the Black Panthers. I can understand why they might feel the need to take up guns or make guns a symbolic, stance for them. But today, we don't understand it. And I think that is because we don't have a real grasp of what racism is and how it can be dismantled structurally, not just symbolically, but structurally. I also think that when you look at police departments, they are miniature armies. And it is not a fair fight. And so, you can't go up against the state with pistols and guns. That's suicide. But it's also indicative of, when I asked earlier, how should the nation respond to political dissent? Well, they respond with tanks and tear gas and rubber bullets and real bullets. And it makes it incredibly difficult for the powerless to procure power. So I think we have to shift our tactics in a lot of ways. But I think that the abolitionist movement is so awesome in that it wasn't just about guns. It was also about the press. It was also about literature. It's also about the arts. There are so many tools that they have in their kit that they are trying to get people to understand why slavery is so bad, why slavery is so wrong, so harmful. And they use everything at their disposal, their very physical bodies, their words, their pen is a sword in a lot of ways. And I think we can use them as a playbook, as a blueprint, as a roadmap for where we might go.
I'm really excited as I look at the questions. I mean, we have multiple questions coming in from across the Baylor family, from across the SHEAR community. I'm really, really happy about that. Here's a question from a longtime SHEARite, Craig Friend. And he writes, first of all, he loves your book and he thinks that he calls it very, very thought-provoking. And I'm going to read from his question. I'm thinking of Anthony Burns' trial in 1854 when a bunch of young Black men joined Thomas Higginson in storming the Boston courtroom. 3 of those young men, teenagers, then became involved in state-level abolitionist organizations. So the question, what are your thoughts about how Black abolitionists' use of violence inspired younger Black men and women to see the movement as active and productive in more visible ways?
That's a really good question. I absolutely believe that once the movement became more forceful, more violent, more direct action, it invigorated not just Black people, but white people as well. I think that the Fugitive Slave Law caused white Northerners who were apathetic, who didn't really care about the institution of slavery, to say, whoa, hold up. I've got to be like a de facto employee for Southern planters? No, thanks. And it made them want to get on board. When tens of thousands of Bostonians saw Anthony Burns being marched back to a slave ship to be sent back south. There's a quote in the book where it was like, they basically said that they were apathetic and then they woke up stark raving abolitionists. Like the next morning they'd evolved. I think that these very public national episodes or incidents like the Christiana Resistance, like Anthony Burns, like the Dred Scott court case, invigorated young people and made them want to fight for something that maybe they had not prioritized or thought was possible in this way. Their actions, they really do shape and accelerate the oncoming of the Civil War in ways that I don't think we could have imagined. I don't think that the Civil War is inevitable, but I do think that when we start to get to these crescendo points, the actions of Black leadership propels, it accelerates the what we know as war, or what becomes the Civil War.
So I'm going to shift gears with this question here. It's 2 questions from 2 Baylor undergraduate students. And each of the students in their comments note that your book illustrates the complex relationship between religion, i.e. Christianity, and slavery, and that the Bible was utilized to justify enslavement and to justify abolition. So Abigail Bragg writes, I was wondering if you could expand on why you chose not to use more biblical references to show how the Bible, as a primary source, to show how the Bible was used in those opposing views of slavery. And then Natalie Stitt writes, in our current fight against prejudice and racism, should religion, especially Christianity, be used to appeal to people's morality, or should we abandon the use of it altogether, given its complicated relationship with slavery and racism?
Man, these are good questions. They're good questions.
Welcome to Baylor, Dr. Jackson.
First, I will say, I will freely admit that one of the shortcomings of the book is that I don't go deep into religion. And that's something that, I feel like it's not just a shortcoming of force and freedom, but I feel like it's also a shortcoming of the field, that oftentimes historians are not very interdisciplinary, and we would benefit, I think, from including other disciplines into our framework of understanding the field of religion or economics or sociology or literature or the arts. All of it can enrich our perspectives. So if there were a Force and Freedom Part 2, absolutely, religion is on the table, and it's on the table in a major way. I thought it would take me down a road I didn't know if I could go or should go. So I allude to it, I talk about it, but it's never like a main feature. Religion is not a main feature, but absolutely the Bible has been weaponized. And when I say weaponized, I mean that in both senses of the term. I mean that white Americans have weaponized the Bible against the enslaved, like slaves obey your masters, that kind of thing. But I also think that the Old Testament is like where enslaved people found their motivation, found their justification for using violence. They saw themselves as Egypt. They saw, or as the Israelites, and they saw Pharaoh as Egypt. And so, or saw the slaveholders as Egypt and Pharaoh, I should say. And so those justifications became real reasons as to how they rationalize the use of force and violence. They would say, listen, I'm made in the image of God. I'm a child of God. I have a God-given right to defend myself. We all do. And I think a lot of the ways is that's how they use the Bible. I will say today, the evangelical church in particular, is so complicated and it's so fraught, and it is so one of the major divisions in the evangelical church, and one of the reasons why you see a lot of Black people leaving the evangelical church is because it has not reconciled, resolved, or reckoned with its racist past, and it has not been willing to relinquish white supremacy. I mean, that's just the short end of it. I think that when we think about January 6th as well, and we think about the storming of the Capitol, there are ministers there. There are like people bearing cross and Christian t-shirts, and, like Christ and the church are getting mobilized and weaponized within that uprising that we saw. And that makes it really difficult for people to see the church as a solution to a lot of these problems, because they see the church as complicit in white supremacy. I mean, if you go and look back at all these pictures of the Klan, they're a Christian organization. They want good old time religion. Like that is their bedrock. And so that really has to be dealt with. But I also think you've got two different stories going on too, because the Black church is not the white church, and so forth and so on. And so Black people will always, I think, see the church as the Black church as a solution to oppression. PBS is doing this really good series now on the Black church. But it's complicated. That's the short answer. It's complicated.
Dr. Carter-Jackson, there are so many questions, so I'm gonna try to combine a couple here, okay, so we can get as many as we can. So I'm gonna combine several questions here from a SHEARite, Mitch Ketchum, who has a biography on Crispus Attucks. One of my colleagues in the history department, Dan Barish, and then another Baylor undergraduate student, Zach Singer, and they asked collectively, do you see Black abolitionists' use of violence in resisting enslavement as the critical factor in ending slavery? And also, what was the ultimate aim of Black violence? Was it to create a community of Black people within the United States, or a more revolutionary separatist movement?
I think, yes, they saw violence as critical. They saw violence as instrumental in the overthrow of slavery. And it goes back to what I said before, this idea that slavery starts in violence, it's sustained by violence, so it will only be overthrown by violence. But they did not see violence as a way of life. They saw violence as like, this is the period, this is the stopping point. So that when we use violence as a way to eradicate chattel slavery, then we start the work of creating a new society. Then we create a new world in which all men are created equal. Like then we go about doing the hard work of nation building and living up to the creeds that America has instituted. But no, it is not meant for violence to beget violence and so forth, and there's no ending point. Violence is meant to stop, to overthrow, to demolish the institution. It's not a way of life. It's not sustainable long term either. It's meant to interrupt It's meant to interrupt, if that makes sense.
It does. No, thank you. And here's another question from a Baylor undergraduate student, Erin Graham. So in your book, you debunked the main narrative that we've been taught and many have believed about the primary use and the efficacy of nonviolence and moral suasion during the abolitionist era. What has been your experience with colleagues, peers, and readers who disagree with your perspective on the abolitionist movement?
That's a good question. So I honestly believe that had my work been written 10 years earlier, it might not have gotten published. 15 years earlier, 20 years earlier. And I'm being dead serious when I say that. Like I had a good conversation with, and I'm forgetting his name. He wrote the Deacons of Self-Defense. I'm drying. I'm having like a brain fart. But he wrote the Deacons of Self-Defense. He reached out to me and he said, hey, listen, I'm reading Force and Freedom. I'm really happy for you. I think we are in a space and a moment where finally we can have these conversations. We can have these honest conversations about the utility of force and the utility of violence. And I think that we have not wanted to talk about it because it's scary, or because it will cost us something, or because we have not wanted to talk about how violence gets wielded. And I say all the time that, you know, when we think about the abolitionist movement, and even when we think about the long freedom struggle, it's never about nonviolence. It was never, and people are like, what the civil rights movement's not about nonviolence. No, it is about a response to violence, a response to violence. Violence at the voting booth, violence at lunch counters, violence in churches where 4 little girls are killed, you know, violence, that same violence they're experiencing in the 19th century, where interracial schools get destroyed, where Black churches get burned down. So the violence is a response to white supremacy. And I think we have to be very honest about that, because we've had these one-sided conversations where all we focused on is, look, Black people with guns, Black people with bombs. And we haven't looked at, wait a second, white people with guns, white people with bombs, white people with tanks. Like, we have not been willing to interrogate the violence of white supremacy and how that has wreaked havoc on Black and brown and marginalized communities. And that's the discussion that I'm really interested in having. Not this sort of pornographic discussion of violence in which we're constantly talking about how white supremacy does all of these horrific things. But my goal was like, how do we talk about the response to that violence? What should the response be of the oppressed? And when it works, when the response is force or violence, and it shuts that down, it stops white supremacy or interrupts supremacy, I think that's a model worth replicating.
Okay, and I think we have time for one more question. I'm going to combine it between a Baylor undergraduate student, Jacob Gotchis, and my colleague in the history department, Bob Elder, who's got a really good book on John C. Calhoun just come out. And so what they both are asking about the gendering of violence, and, you know, was the philosophy of violence gendered? And if you could say it was the ideology of masculinity and honor culture, which was also made violence righteous. How did you engage that in the book?
So masculinity, I think when I first started the book, that was sort of the angle that I was pushing, because, you know, James McCune Smith talks about this a lot, that they won't respect us. They won't see us as brothers unless we beat them down a time or two. Like, but I realized that, wait a second, Black women are engaged in force. Black women are engaged in violence. And so even though Black women are sort of sporadic throughout the book, because I refused to sort of do, and now the chapter on women, like I didn't want to do that. I wanted to show, like, no, Black women are everywhere. And oftentimes when we use these vague words like crowds and mobs and gatherings, Black women are there. Women are there, but they get erased because we think mobs are men, or they get erased because we think the crowd is all made up of men. And so I just recently published an article in the Journal of Slavery and Abolition called Dare You Meet a Woman, Black Women, Violence, Black Women Abolitionists and Violence. And it gave me an opportunity to take all of these wonderful stories and incorporate even more stories and really just focus on the role of Black women abolitionists and how they used violence. And to me, that's really important, because I didn't want people to think that men have a monopoly on using force or guns. They absolutely don't. Women pick up guns, women pick up pistols. We saw Eliza Parker picked up a corn cutter, you know, and was willing to use it and was clear she knew how. So I don't think that this violence is a one-way street where men are just fighting men. I think women are there and they're doing the hard work. And in some ways, I argue or believe that Black women have even more of an impetus to use violence because of because of sexual assaults, because of rape, because of the theft of their children. They have even more reason to turn to force and violence as a solution for their lives.
Dr. Carter Jackson, first of all, this has been so much fun, and I thank you so very much. But everybody, that brings us to the end of our 2021 Black History Month Book Talk, co-sponsored by the Baylor University History Department and SHEAR. Dr. Carter Jackson, on behalf of SHEAR, on behalf of the History Department, my colleague, Dr. Amy Greenberg, Robert Lockhart, Daniel Watkins, thank you so much for your time. Enjoy your prize ceremony tonight. You've earned that recognition. And to our virtual audience, I want to thank everyone for your interest in her fabulous work. As she just put the book up, I want to encourage everyone to buy a copy of Force and Freedom. And let's all try to talk more about Black history until we do this again next year. Bye-bye for now.